We just had a flood of people come in. I can't see everybody on one screen. So I just want to commence by acknowledging that we're all on different lands, but I'm speaking on the traditional lands and waters of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I'm actually looking out on the beautiful waters of the Gadigal people, and with the western light coming onto my face, I can see. And I want to acknowledge elders past, present, for gifting us with the possibility of being here. Normally I live on Dharawal land, so I also want to pay my respects to that land. So welcome everybody. I'm Dani Solomon. I'm one of the co-conveners of this event with my colleague Sophie Chow. And I'm just going to say a few introductory words before we introduce our two pairs of speakers for today. So as obviously, because you're all here, you're all part of the very vigorous conversations that we've been having amongst ourselves about the value of interdisciplinary research. And I think that's true in many fields, but it's particularly true for those of us who work in fields that are studied by people who come from the humanities and social sciences, but from very different perspectives from people who come from the natural sciences. And I think many of us are coming to increasingly appreciate that if we're going to really rigorously explore the questions that we're interested in around animal and environmental justice and ethics, and also to build really rich understandings of the relationships between humans and the more than human world, we need to be able to be in conversation with these different perspectives in a really lively conversation. But that quite broad set of recognitions then quickly opens up to very practical questions like, what does doing that look like? All of us have been trained within our own disciplines, so presumably we can talk to people in those disciplines about a kind of some sort of rough canon of thinkers or intellectual history that we share, a set of methods, even if there's a kind of broader scope that we only use some of those methods. But there's really no interdisciplinary canon and there's no suite of interdisciplinary methods. And maybe that's a really good thing, right? Because that leaves open all of the possibilities for improvisation and experimentation. But it can also leave us feeling disoriented about how do we do this and are we doing it the right way? Is there guidance that we could be getting from each other? Now, I know that many of us have been having conversations amongst ourselves, doing our own thinking. Some people like Astrida, Neimanis, who's going to be the respondent today, is setting up interdisciplinary learning programs at the university. But what it seemed to us and what was really the motivation for having these workshops was that we weren't really having a rich public conversation amongst ourselves. And so we weren't sharing the type of experiments and stumbles that we were all making as we kind of grapple our way through this territory. So the objective of these two workshops is not for the 4 pairs of speakers that we have to lay out the rules for doing interdisciplinary research in more than human worlds the right way. In fact, we're really clear that all of us, so I'm going to be speaking with Ariane tomorrow, all of us are just going to be talking about how we've done it, what we've come across, where we've fallen, how we've pulled ourselves back up again, who we've leaned on, and really just to open up a conversation. We certainly, there's no pretensions here about we're going to be presenting how to do interdisciplinarity. The way that the sessions are going to work is we've got 2 pairs of speakers on each day. They'll speak for kind of 20, 30 minutes each. And then we've got a respondent on each day, which will give us, so it's about 10 minutes. So we'll have almost an hour for conversation to take place afterwards. And we're really hoping that that conversation isn't going to be the type of boring, someone puts up their virtual hand, asks a question to the speaker answers, someone else puts up their hand. There's quite an extraordinary array of people here. I'm sure all of you could have been speakers at these events. And so what we really want is for people to talk about what they're doing, what they're thinking about, ask each other questions, bounce off each other's ideas. I am highly inept at facilitating on Zoom, so I'm going to do my really, really level best to follow the chat. And if people can either put comments in chat or put your virtual hand up, if I miss you, then just privately message me in chat and say, I've had my hand up for ages, could you please pay attention to me? And that will flash at me in red. And then I promise I'll do my very best to come to you. So before I invite the speakers to start, I just want to acknowledge a few people in particular. Evie or Genevieve Wright, who is here, who is the guru from SEI, from the Sydney Environment Institute, who made all this happen, and actually Gemma Viney, who's not here, but who was the first person at SEI who worked with us. And of course, the Sydney Environment Institute more generally, David Schlossberger, Michelle St. Anne, who facilitated this and helped to make it happen. Then my partner in crime, the wonderful Sophie Chow, who will be facilitating tomorrow, with whom we dreamed this up together in far more, and I will just say this temptingly, far more pornographic terms than we're going to be giving you today. I can come back to that later if that's tempting for people, but it kind of the idea of flirting and on from there. Flirting as a form of interdisciplinary engagement. I also want to thank Sonia van Wickelen, who is going to be here for part of today, who was there at the beginning in the conversation with us and will be the respondent tomorrow, and Astrida Neimanis, who will be responding today, but is a great inspiration for us in thinking about interdisciplinarity. So with no more further ado, I'll introduce both pairs of speakers. I'm not going to give them the long introduction because that was in the flyer, so I'm sure you've all read that. So the first pair is John Martin, who's the research scientist based at the Taronga Institute of Science and Learning, and Thom van Dooren from the Department of Gender Cultural Studies at the University of Sydney. They'll speak first, and then we'll hand over to Margaret Barbour, who is both at the University of Sydney and at the University of Waikato, and Dalia Nassar, who is a philosopher at the University of Sydney, but is right now in hotel quarantine in Sydney, having just returned from about a year in Germany. So if I can hand over to Thom and John, unless, Evie, I've missed anything that I should have said. No? Okay, beautiful, thank you.
Thanks, Danny. Thanks very much to Danny and Sophie and Genevieve for organising. So yeah, John and I have just prepared some basic notes, things to try and remember to say about two main interdisciplinary collaborations that we are involved in, one at the moment and one in the past. So we're just going to say a little bit about those, draw out some of the challenges, the lessons, and yeah, what we're learning and what we're doing. But our conversation really began earlier than that, when John was just finishing, I think, his PhD on urban birds, urban environments, and I was just writing a book on endangered birds, and we met and started talking. And so that was many years ago now. I don't know how long ago, but anyway, maybe 10 years ago. And so
more than 10, Thom.
More than 10.
We're old, mate.
And so our projects have sort of grown out of that conversation. So maybe, John, did you want to just say a little bit about your background, and then I'll do the same, and then we can jump into the projects.
Yeah, so I have a real interest in species adaptation, and urban environments are an amazing space where we see wildlife, in this highly altered world because of us, of course, because of humans and how we've changed the landscape. And so that's a very interesting aspect. And of course, what's a natural extension is conservation. And when we're thinking about conservation, one of the most important aspects that we need to consider, and is actually seldom adequately considered, is people. You know, if people aren't supportive, aware, engaged, then conservation tends not to be overly successful, particularly where it's reliant on people. And urban areas, surprisingly, provide a habitat for a range of threatened species, as well as some unique urban adapters.
I am a philosopher originally by training, and I guess I work in a more interdisciplinary place in all of my work between philosophy, cultural studies, anthropology, science and technology studies, and mostly looking at endangered species also, and I guess considering a lot of those what's sometimes called human dimensions of conservation issues. And so I guess there's a sort of natural synergy between mine and John's interests, which originally formed around also a shared interest in birds. So I'll go to the next slide and maybe say a bit about our, those are just some urban birds actually. I don't think we've got anything to say about them, except John does a fair bit of work on two of them at least. And I was working on penguins when we met, that's how we met. So next slide is actually our first collaborative project together, focused on Sydney's cockatoos. And that, maybe if John, if you say a little about your prior work that we were sort of piggybacking on.
Yeah, so for those of you who aren't familiar, this is a sulphur-crested cockatoo. And they're a large bird, you know, sort of 800 grams, size of your forearm. And one of the things that's quite interesting about them is the fact that they have adapted, as I sort of mentioned earlier, a range of species have, but this species has adapted to urban environments. So much so that they solicit food from people. Actually going up and knocking on people's windows, even when they've once they've established a bit of a relationship to know that there's food going to be offered, they'll readily return to those same places. And so a lot of people in the community feed cockatoos and feed a range of different wildlife, and it's an interesting space because it's often frowned upon from a conservation perspective to be feeding wildlife. You know, in New South Wales, the National Parks and Wildlife has a policy of let the wildlife be wild, and so hence don't feed them. So trying to talk about the framing of how Thom and I started our research, which we're about to get into, was from an ecology project. So ecology might not be everyone's interest area, but the thing that's quite unique about this species is it's big, it's loud, it interacts with people, but we know very little about it. So we started a project where we were marking individual birds so that we could actually be interacting, learning about, and therefore observing individuals. And that led to a large number of people in the community reporting their observations and sharing their interactions and their stories. So hence the people connecting to these animals in a very unique way. Thom, maybe we'll just bounce between each other.
Yeah, so we were sort of building on John's wing tags project, and in particular, well, in part on the infrastructure of actual wing tags on birds, but also the infrastructure of the Facebook groups and all of the other social interactions that emerged around those wing tags that allowed people to identify birds and to begin to share their stories and share their interactions with them. So the project began really as and sort of ended also as more of a teaching project than anything else. So we had a group of students who were final year students in the environmental humanities major at UNSW. And we reached out to John, some of us from that program, and we started talking about how we could teach the students some of these interdisciplinary methods. So John taught our students, who are humanities students, some things that they didn't know about following birds, about observing bird behaviour and things like that. We worked with John, with that Facebook group, to find people for the students to go and interview about their relationships with cockatoos, about why they observed them and what they got out of that, and why they felt a desire to share that information on social media. And so it was really an educational project as much as anything else. I guess we'll just, one of the key things that came out of that, maybe sort of really the only output, if you like, that came out of that work was a paper that we did. The four of us academics and a whole lot of the students who are involved in research, teasing out some of those questions. I was just going to pull one aspect of the paper out that I thought was particularly interested me and was particularly interesting in terms of the interdisciplinary collaboration, and that was thinking about friendship, interspecies friendship, and what that means. So that I think really required us to draw on disciplinary knowledges and expertise and methods from across biology and philosophy and anthropology. We were drawing on interviews that the students had done. We were drawing on John's knowledge of bird behaviour and birds' capacities to identify individual people. And we were just thinking about what friendship means across species lines. And I think it was a much richer conversation for being able to take the cockatoos' experiences of all of this, what the cockatoos know, what they get out of it, as much into account as we could think about the more sociological and philosophical questions about friendship and what it means to people.
And so from my perspective, it was certainly a question that had been bubbling away for a long time, the human side of it. Of course, being an ecologist and having a research project that was trying to learn about how the birds move in the landscape, the different habitats that they use, the different foods that they eat, was, pretty small and really focused into my field. But the side that we weren't particularly engaging with was the human side. And so we were engaging with it in that we were trying to get people to help us learn about the birds. They were reporting information, but we weren't necessarily trying to understand what the people were getting out of their experiences. And so it was really nice opportunity working with Thom and Paul and Eben and then the students to be able to reach out to people who were very much engaged in the project. They'd been reporting birds for a number of years. They'd been involved on social media. They were the interested people in the community. And so we then, as Thom said, reached out and had students interview them to learn about their experiences, in particular, why they were interested, what they were getting out of it. And friendship was a main theme. It was actually quite a great conversation.
Mm. Yeah, okay. So I'll move on to the project that we are working on at the moment together with a team of other folks who are on the slide there. This one really, it began strangely, it began out of a conversation. It began out of a shared interest that John and I had with Dita, whose surname I can never say.
Julia is the official pronunciation. It's Swiss.
Okay. So a shared interest in how people are interacting with wildlife, especially in urban environments, and wanting to create spaces for people to think, to share their stories, and also to create resources for people to have different kinds of interactions with urban wildlife. So at the moment, it's a website at urbanfieldnaturalist.org. And it's doing basically those two things: a space for sharing stories. I know there are quite a few people here who have shared stories, so thank you. and it's been really successful. We actually can't keep up with the backlog of stories that are coming in, which is really nice. And the other aspect of it, though, is resources that we're creating for people to have different kinds of interactions with wildlife. So there's just two on the slide there. One of them is just trying to break down what it is to be an urban field naturalist in our minds, and the other is a guide to crow appreciation. So it's a sort of a riffing on the kind of field guide genre, but thinking instead about just providing people with scientific data or with life history information or whatever it might be, thinking about what it means to really appreciate crows in the environment and trying to provide more of that kind of information that draws people into a different kind of relationship with crows. And we've got a whole bunch of other guides in development, including one about watching ants fight, which is a little bit weird. We've got one on interacting, learning about snail homing behaviour in your backyard. So simple steps you can take to observe the snails and how they make their way around your backyard. So different resources like that we've been trying to create alongside the sharing of stories to open up this space for discussion about urban wildlife.
And it might be a field that, so there's the field of citizen science, and maybe all of you are familiar with citizen science, which is generally, well, in an ecological sense, it's often asking people to report the sighting of a species. So you learn about its presence in a location at a date and a time. Maybe it's how many of them there were, and you can delve into more detail as well about behaviours or breeding and these different things. Citizen science can, of course, be a huge number of diverse projects, whether it's about different weather patterns or, you know, even about cultural information and different experiences. But what we were aiming for with the urban field naturalist was not to collect data on species, but to try and engage people with the biodiversity around them and through story. So the idea that whether it's in your everyday life, in your backyard, you know, we talk about looking through the kitchen window and you see something happen, and it inspires you to actually think about, all right, that bird's just landed on that tree and it's eating the fruit. And, you know, there are thousands and thousands of stories. I always say to Thom, I just had a walk and I just got 3 stories, but, you know, I don't write 3 stories a day. But you know, I just see stories constantly because I'm always seeing different things. And sometimes it's just seeing some mushrooms pop up under a tree that I haven't seen before, but I can envisage the fact that it's something that I'm observing in my world that I find interesting. If I'm finding it interesting, maybe other people will also enjoy this story, and perhaps through reading my story, and of course this is all of our stories, we might be able to inspire other people to pay more attention. You know, it's one of the things that we've got up on the screen there, a few simple steps. Starts with slow down, observe, record and collect, ask questions and share. And the idea there is, if we think about the tradition of a field naturalist going out into the wilderness and documenting all these different species, well, let's not overlook our own backyards and our local parks and the areas that we interact with on our day-to-day offer opportunities for us to experience and engage with nature.
So I think one of the aspects that's really interesting to me about this collaboration is that it really didn't begin also as a research project. And in fact, we're still sort of figuring out what the research questions are. Instead, we began with a shared interest. We began with a desire to try and create an online space, to create a conversation amongst the 5 of us who are collaborating, and just to see what comes out of it. And that's been really productive, although we haven't yet produced any kind of peer-reviewed output. So the university might not agree that it's been productive, but it's been really productive, I think, and stimulating for all of us. So some of the research questions that are starting to emerge and that we're starting to write about, one of them that particularly interests me is this question of recovering the naturalist tradition and what that means, what it means to be a naturalist in an urban Anthropocene setting, how we might inherit the naturalist tradition, which is one that is bound up with histories of colonization and extraction and all sorts of other very problematic processes, but it's also one that has woven into it a kind of philosophical attitude, one that's about wonder and appreciation, one that's about ethics, and that fuses the scientific and the poetic in really interesting ways. So we don't want to give up on the naturalist tradition, and we think it's got a lot of interesting contemporary relevance, but it's not without its problems. So that's part of what we've been trying to explore in some of the research we're doing, and in looking at the stories that people submit, at the relationships people have with wildlife around them. So that's one set of questions. Are there any others, John, that you wanted to highlight that are research questions that?
Look, one of the areas of research that I'm involved with DIDA is about school kids' connection to nature. And so from that conversation and our learnings there, we're quite interested in the urban field naturalists reaching out to the school kids. And so there's, this whole, the cliche of the children are our future. Well, obviously, but, if they're actually appreciating nature more, and if they're taking the time to observe and ideally putting a few words down, we're talking about short stories here, up to 200 words sort of is a guide. It can be quite achievable for pretty much, obviously, all of us can do this. It's not something where we need to have a deep understanding. And the aim there is to try and get kids to maintain their actual passion and interest. And so the research that we're doing in the school kids' connection to nature space, which is building on the global literature, particularly for Western countries, is showing that kids that are leaving primary school and going into high school have a disconnection to nature pretty much around that age of 11. So it'd be nice to be able to integrate, and it's something we've talked about, but we're yet to pursue a greater relationship with schools and school kids, and trying to actually foster their experiences so that there's opportunities for them to maintain connections to nature, and I guess that appreciation and wonder of the natural world.
And just one other quick research question that we're just starting to think about is a question of cohabitation and living with difficult wildlife, if you like, and thinking about what this approach of appreciation and of cultivating a different kind of understandings of species that might be, destroying your balcony or waking you up in the morning or whatever it might be. What difference would it make to those relationships where they sometimes have conservation implications, where people are, don't want to live with particular species? What kind of difference might be this urban field naturalist appreciation and wonder open up in managing or intervening differently into those kinds of relationships? So those are some of the things we're playing with. I think one of the things that for me that's most exciting about the collaboration is just the energy and enthusiasm that everyone is bringing to it. And I think partly that's because it's not a kind of another research project. It's one that's much more experimental and playful, and we just sort of have an idea and see where it goes.
And I might just add to that, Thom, which is, we all do research with people around the world. You don't always interact with them, but by some queer circumstance, due to the current global circumstances, the 5 of us on this project have only met on Skype and Zoom. We haven't actually had a face-to-face meeting for all 5 of us. It's a very new project that's only launched a couple of months ago. But yeah, there is a lot of energy, and it's something that we all look forward to our meetings on this topic. I do know there's a bunch of questions though, so shall we jump to those?
So, John, but before can I just to try and be a little bit concrete, just point out a couple of lessons?
Oh yes, sorry, yes.
We've taken away from this, and they're all very tentative lessons. I guess the first one is that it's frequently noted that success in these kinds of interdisciplinary collaborations is very much about the personalities and collaborative skills of the people involved. You've got to find the right folks to work with, and people who are willing to be interested in other kinds of disciplinary questions. So I think we've got the right kind of people, which is nice. I think that is a helpful thing to keep in mind. We haven't, though, had a reading group or anything like that that would expose us to one another's approaches or questions. What we've had instead is, I think, a much slower and more intensive process of learning together through collaboration. So I've learned an awful lot about how John and Dieter approach the world, approach knowledge making as scientists, but also our other two collaborators, Zoe and Andrew, who are both designers. And I've never collaborated with designers before, but some of the questions that they're asking about what does a field guide look like, and how do you actually design one that does the kinds of inheriting the naturalist tradition that we're talking about. So they're asking totally different questions. And so, yeah, we haven't had a formalized process of encountering one another's approaches. We've sort of done it experimentally and ad hoc, and I think that's been really productive for us anyway. I'll just say a couple more. Longer term relationships, I think, can help, but they aren't necessary. It's also a lot about people's personal skills and aptitudes, as much about that as it is about disciplinary training, I think. So a lot of what people bring to the collaboration is not their particular disciplinary background. It's a whole lot of other things that you didn't know that they did. The best example I have is that John is a social media whiz, which was not something I knew about him before, but that's been a really vital part of our collaboration. Another big thing is that we have had weekly meetings, which is not something I've ever done with collaborators before. They've been on Zoom, but they've been fantastic, and we've been using Slack, which is not something I knew about either, where which has lots of discussion boards about every different little facet of the project that we're working on. And so that kind of organizational process, the regular meetings and a good way of keeping all this stuff together and having ongoing discussions has been really important. And then I think the final one is, which is sort of true of both of our projects, is that you don't need research questions to start with. And for me, that was always a bit of a barrier to these kinds of interdisciplinary projects, having that sit down and figuring out what are your questions, what are my questions, where's the overlap, what are our shared questions. You can start like that. I'm sure that probably is more efficient, but you can also start through a kind of more experimental collaboration and figure out those questions and shared interests along the way. And that is working for us. Anything else, John?
No, I think you've covered it. I guess just we are all passionate about this, these projects, and so there hasn't been any roadblocks or sticking points. It's even though we don't all know each other particularly well. There's the common theme as sort of keeping everyone's drive high.
If you two have finished the more formal part, I might just be a bit iterative here, because the couple of questions that have come up are quite specific to the presentation. So maybe we could ask those now, and then the latter part can be more of a free flow discussion. So the two that I have, and please feel free to ask them yourselves. I've got one from Kelvin Genselen asking Thom, who's also a student of philosophy, wanted to ask a little bit more about how your knowledge of philosophy matches with the project and the deeper possibilities of a philosophical approach. Kelvin, do you want to add anything to that yourself?
No, I think you say everything. I understand that there is like some linked project when you talk about the social relationships, but also I want to know if you can be more specific when you say that your philosophical approach can also match with the project. I don't know how to say that, sorry.
Yeah, thanks. I should say I'm not a very good philosopher, so and I've never been a very conventional philosopher. So I think of my work much more as field philosophy, and so it's already often involving ethnographic work and other kinds of collaborations of scientists and things. So I don't have a clearly worked out sense of what does philosophy contribute to this discussion. I'd have to really try and tease those things, that, you know, those particular parts of philosophical training out of what is for me just a much more interdisciplinary approach. But I think certainly we draw on philosophical literatures. For example, in the Cockatoo Project, literatures around friendship, which are often coming from philosophy and philosophers, and thinking about what that means, and then trying to apply those to interspecies friendships. So a lot of it is more about literatures, I think, the philosophical elements of it. But I guess that throughout all of my work, and that goes for this collaboration too, I think there's an interest in terminology and categories, in the assumptions we make about the categories that we form, which has to inform all of this kind of work. But I can't give you a concrete example of where I've been doing that. But maybe, I mean, even the discussion of what is the naturalist tradition, and how is the naturalist tradition sort of always already a philosophical tradition that has inherited sort of questions of ethics and poetics and things like that into the way that the environment or nature is thought about. Does that help?
I imagine this will come up again with Dalia in the next presentation as well. Sorry, did I interrupt, Thom?
No, I was just saying Dalia is much more qualified to talk about what philosophy can do. Let's wait for her.
And then Isabel had some comments about some other platforms that she wanted to share, but also a question about the universality of the age of disenchantment. Was that only based on Australia, or is that a more global finding? Isabel, do you want to say anything about that yourself, and also to talk about those platforms?
Hello, everyone. Well, these platforms are very, National Geographic, they offer some funds if you want to use these platforms, and they are basically citizen science projects to discover biodiversity in your area. So I think they are quite good to check if you are interested in this urban biodiversity and also the interaction with the citizens. And then my question is, like, I heard that you say that at 11, when you are 11 years old, you disconnect. And it's funny because I remember that my memories just stopped when I was 10 years old. So and I don't know what happened then. Maybe we get busy or something, and then we stop to play in nature, and then we just disconnect from nature. So I'm wondering if this is like around the world, or it's just in Western societies.
Yeah, so the bulk of the literature comes from Western, so predominantly UK, more so than even Europe, and then North America, and some in Australia. And 11 is sort of a pinch point, but of course it varies with respect to different individuals, of course. One of the key things that hasn't been quite teased out is that transition that you just referred to, which is people go, so in Australia, they go to high school. You get more freedom generally from your parents when you move to high school. You might have to travel further, but you also have increased workloads. You have social changes. You also have, physiological changes. So anyway, there's a lot of things that are happening there that are difficult to say it's one thing or the other, but it has been shown to be relatively consistent. And so with respect to the Citizen Science Project, there's hundreds and hundreds of citizen science projects out there. So if there's anything if there's a specific area you're interested in, you could always just, that word and citizen science and see what comes up. Some of the global projects like iNaturalist are really great, and they're really simple to use. You just take a photo of the species and submit it. And of course, we'd love the thousands and thousands of people who are engaging with nature in that way to, you know, get on board with the urban field naturalist as well, and take a moment and observe what they're, not just the species, but, you know, the experience that they're having. And, you know, often we get stories sent in, and sometimes we give people a little bit of feedback just to sort of enhance their story. And a lot of the time it's actually putting them in the story. I walked from my house down to the beach, and whilst I was walking through the park, I happened to see a magpie swoop someone's dog, you know, whereas they've just sent us a story and said, I saw a magpie swooping a dog. And, you know, that's can be interesting as well, but it sort of misses the journey of what they were doing and how, and, you know, it doesn't have to necessarily capture their feelings or emotions. We don't really, haven't gone into that space so much about it, but it's more, I guess, what's caught their attention, what's made them actually be willing to stop and share a story, as opposed to, you know, and I often say to people, have a look at your phone, have a look at your photos. When's the last photo you've got of an animal or a plant or something like that? What's the last thing that stopped you? And you went, oh, I'm going to get a photo of that. That's cool. Well, that's worth writing a story about. And I'm hoping all of you are going to submit a story.
Thank you, John. Danny has just dropped off Zoom, so I'm going to take over the chairing until she joins us again. There's a couple more questions coming in, which are actually really linked to what you were just talking about, John, but perhaps in the interest of leaving time for a broader discussion, I might save those for afterwards, and thank Thom and John for their wonderful talk, encourage everyone to submit a story, which I have, and invite Dalia, Nassar and Margaret Barbour to share some of their experiences in interdisciplinary research. Thanks again, John and Thom.
Okay, so my name is Dalia Nassar. I'm a philosopher and a historian of philosophy, and I have been working over the last 6 or so years on a project on the history of interdisciplinarity. And in particular, I'm investigating the ways that the role of art in the emergence of ecology and ecological perspectives, or what you might call ecological consciousness. So I come with a kind of a really deep historical interest in interdisciplinarity as such, and I'm convinced that, well, as a historian, I just know that in the past, everything was far more interdisciplinary than it is today. And so I was excited about pursuing something interdisciplinary given my interest in the history of interdisciplinarity. And I just want to say that when I started thinking about the history of interdisciplinarity, it was with a kind of systematic goal of what can we learn from the past, from the ways in which people in the past worked together, and how can we use that as a model for contemporary interdisciplinarity. So I just want to give that as a bit of background before I let Margaret give you some sense of the history of our particular relationship and speak about herself as well.
Thanks, Dalia. So I'm a plant physiologist. I study how plants respond to the environment and to other organisms like microbes and fungi and things like that in the environment. And can I just say that this kind of a setting is quite challenging for me. I feel quite overwhelmed by ideas that I'm not familiar with. So you'll please excuse me if I seem naive and ignorant about some ideas. I could talk at length about how plants function and how they respond to the environment, but I think I'll bore you, so I'm not going to do that. So the reason why I started thinking about how useful it might be to work with someone outside my discipline is because I got to a point where I realized it didn't matter how many cool papers I wrote about how plants respond to the environment. No one beyond my scientific peers were reading them. And that was kind of disappointing to me because I really wanted people to be passionate and to love plants as much as I do and to care about plants as much as I do. And yet the only people I was talking to were fellow scientists like myself who already cared about plants. And so I realized I needed to go outside my own comfort zone and reach out into a different discipline. And of course, there's two ways I could have done that. I could have tried to learn about scientific communication, which is incredibly valuable way to talk about, you know, science. But I decided to try something different, which was to try and reach out to the humanities to see, because I thought if I want to persuade people to care about plants, I need to talk to people who understand people, and that's not me. You know, scientists try not to think about people. They try to take themselves out of being human, and so I looked around for opportunities to collaborate with people outside science. And an opportunity presented itself because at the time I was Associate Dean of Research for Science, but I was reviewing funding proposals in the humanities. And I happened across a funding proposal that Dalia wrote to visit Germany, and which she did. So obviously successful funding proposal. And she was talking about things that I didn't know very much about, but I knew that she cared about plants just from the way she was writing, and the kind of ideas that she was talking about in the proposal. And so I wrote her an email and I said, hey, I'm wondering if you might be interested in working on a funding proposal that I was preparing. It looks like we might have things in common. And thankfully she wrote back in a positive way, because it would be very easy for someone to think, oh, I have nothing to say to this scientist, she's weird, and I you know, we have nothing in common. But luckily Dalia is not like that, and she wrote back almost straight away and sent me a copy of a chapter that she was preparing on metaphorical plants, and that just was it for me. I knew from that point that I'd found the right person, and that we were going to have lots of interesting things to say to each other. Not that we would understand each other very often, maybe at the beginning, but that we would have interesting things to say to each other. And so maybe I could now pass the story back to Dalia and she could say what we did next.
Yeah, well, I think just I think it's really important to always emphasize that if Margaret hadn't been in touch with me, I definitely wouldn't have approached her. And I think my experience as someone in the humanities is that most scientists just don't think that it's relevant to collaborate with people in the humanities. So I don't have the guts to go up to a scientist and say, hey, I'd really like to learn more about what you're doing, and hopefully we can have something to say to each other. So I think that was a huge step. And when there's a kind of openness on the part of the natural sciences, then of course it's exciting, and how could you not want to take up an opportunity when someone really is genuinely interested and expresses that kind of interest? So it was over many, many meetings that we eventually came up with a research question. I think it's really important to emphasize that we just enjoyed each other's company in part, and that's something we liked. Talking to each other, we liked learning from each other, but we also found it very hard to do what we were doing. So we would have a coffee every now and then, and we had many, many coffees without ever really achieving a goal at the end of our coffee, or maybe coming, very, very in a very small way forward. But the underlying kind of basic thing that kept us going is that we thought there was something there. We just needed to discover what it was. And I think it's really important that we didn't have a clear question to begin with, because we had to do a lot of exploring. Who is this person as a researcher, and what kinds of skills and knowledges do they bring, and how can we bring our knowledges together? So there was absolutely no presupposition about what to get out of this collaboration. It was more like, this could lead somewhere, let's keep going with it, and let's just keep talking. And I think this open-endedness was what allowed us to continue talking over 3 years, and eventually writing something together. But it was really, I think, Margaret's openness and this sense of, we don't know where this is going, let's just keep talking. And then we started a reading group, and that was probably how we started to home in on the one hand on how far we were from each other, to just realize how the concepts that we use are actually, when I say organism, I mean something different than when Margaret says organism. And that was actually quite shocking, that we have two different interpretations of the very same concept that is a very basic concept. And so having the reading group made everything far more concrete and made us realize what kinds of tasks we have ahead of us, but also what kinds of questions might be pursued. However, I have to say that finally, when we came upon that question that really excited us, it wasn't in reading, through a particular reading. It was just, we were sitting at a cafe. And then Margaret started describing characteristics of plants. And I'll let Margaret speak now, but that's how the question emerged. So we've developed a kind of vocabulary by that point, and we've developed a sense of where we don't know what we know and what we don't know, and what we need to do and what we can't do. And then we started to work within the limits of our disciplines and our own limits as researchers and thinkers. And then we started, I think, just talking about plants or trees in particular one day. And I'll let Margaret say more about what was going on in that conversation.
Thanks, Dalia. So yeah, I can remember it vividly, because I love that feeling when you're thinking deeply about something and then an idea blossoms. And so it was a very memorable moment. And we were talking about trees and their form. And I was telling Dalia the story about how I measure tree rings, the chemical composition of tree rings, and that from that chemical composition, I can look back at the history of the tree and its personal history. And that has always interested me, because it's a record of the environment, but also a record of how that tree is responding to the environment over that time. And it's a much more honest record than in other types of organisms like animals, because tree rings don't turn over. If I'm careful about the composition that I'm measuring, I can get the true history of the tree. And I have to translate it through science, but it is the tree talking, if you like. It's not too much interpretation on top of that. And so from that conversation, which could easily get very technical and boring, so I'm not going to do that, this idea emerged between us, and it was genuinely just the two of us coming with the idea together that trees have this embodied history. So they embody their history, and then we can interpret that from our own observations and measurements. And that was sort of the seed of the idea that developed into some, for me, very challenging philosophical thought about dialogue between plants and the environment, and who is in control, who is determining the environment, and the fact that it's a joint thing. It's not, yeah. So that was the gem of the idea, and it's really developed into something quite interesting for me, because without a philosophy background, I was really challenged by some of the ideas that Dalia was suggesting and describing. So I'm going to hand back to Dalia now.
So exactly, in that conversation, we came up with the insight, or we had the insight, that trees as organisms embody their history and their environment in a way that no other organism seems to. They literally have it on their very bodies, on their corporeality. And so I was fascinated by what that implies for the organism-environment relationship, which is a crucial philosophical question, one that philosophers of biology have been trying to ask and respond to for, since before Darwin. And very few have actually talked about plants. So when you read contemporary philosophy of biology, most people are really looking at animals, and they come close to ideas about embodied history, but never as close as what we came, not in the same way to what we came up with, because very rarely are plants, you know, the center of attention. It's usually animals, and very rarely are trees as such. And so we were distinguishing the essence, say, or the crucial character of trees, and saying there's something there that distinguishes them from other organisms, and it's that they really inhabit their environment, and their environment inhabits them. And we were trying to understand that environment-organism relationship and what that implies for the larger philosophical question about organism-environment relationship, but also for ecological questions like, well, what can we say about the very notion of an environment in light of what we're learning about the fact that trees and environments are so closely connected that it's almost impossible to separate the two. Is that a relevant concept? Is it not a relevant concept? Another question that we became interested in is what can we learn for ourselves as human beings, as actors or agents, from this specific distinctive tree-environment relationship. So out of that very crucial concept of the embodied history of tree, we started to, lots of questions, research questions started to emerge, both in philosophically relevant from the philosophy of biology perspective, but also from ecological perspectives. And eventually we started talking about potentially writing a paper together. Do you want to say more about that?
Yeah, sure. So again, we encountered challenges quite quickly when we tried to write together, because the scientific approach to writing, I don't know if you guys have ever attempted to read scientific papers, but they're very dry, very structured. Over the years I've been a scientist, I've developed a way to write scientifically. It works because I'm published, right? But trying to write in a different way for a different audience about ideas that are developing as you go along, that was very challenging. And so yeah, it was hard, I think. And Dalia just kept saying to me, if you start writing, the ideas will develop as you write. And I'm like, no, I have to have the story straight in my head before I start. And it needed a lot of encouragement. Dalia needed to encourage me a lot to let that go, that I could allow the ideas to develop as I put them down on paper. So I've still got a lot to learn in that regard. But that whole different approach to writing down your ideas and developing your ideas, I think is quite challenging across disciplines. And my writing has necessarily been constrained by my discipline, and it's difficult to step out of that, just like it would be difficult for Dalia to write a scientific paper, I imagine. And so, I think that is not a challenge to be underestimated as you try to develop a multidisciplinary type approach to research. But we have written something. We've written 2 things together. So I don't know how successful they are. We'll have to see how people respond. But it did allow me, for the first time since, I don't know, maybe high school, to actually try and write something that was even vaguely poetic, if you like, vaguely creative. And so that was quite liberating for me. So yeah, it'd be interesting to hear, Dalia, if you want to describe it from your perspective, trying to write together.
So for me, it was much easier than for Margaret, because we were writing for a more humanities audience, and I didn't have to change my writing style as much. I just had to make it less jargony, less philosophically, in-circle-y, and more open to a general humanities perspective. And so I didn't have as much of a challenge in that respect as Margaret did. And I think it's relevant to discuss the kinds of different skills that we both had. And at one point when we were having our coffees before we reached the crucial idea, we both became very apprehensive about the possibility that we both had to learn a lot about each other's disciplines and each other's skills. And that just would have ended the project right then and there, because I don't have another 10 years to become a biologist, and vice versa. And what we came to realize was that really for us at this stage in our lives, it doesn't make sense to be a philosopher and a biologist, but rather a philosopher working with a biologist and a biologist working with a philosopher. And I think that means relying on the other person, trusting the other person in a deep way, trusting that they're going to tell you and explain to you the kinds of things that you wouldn't otherwise as a non-biologist understand. So she was bringing in the science, she was bringing in the science articles, and we were talking about them. I wasn't going and looking for the science articles. And Margaret did a lot more research in the humanities, I have to say, than I did. But on the other hand, we were doing a lot of discussing of the humanities stuff so that I can help her understand the key concepts and the questions. And so we were both sort of helping each other, teaching each other in a way without the expectation that I have to become a biologist or that she would have to become a philosopher. And I think it's the sort of sense of trust and relying that the other person has the skills as a biologist and as a philosopher, that we could therefore bring those skills together, that enabled us to continue working. Otherwise, it would have just been too overwhelming. Did you want to say anything about that, Margaret?
No.
Yeah. But the writing was definitely, so we've written 2 pieces, one for Aeon, which is an online, more popular journal, and that was about 3,000 words, and that was a lot of fun, and it took about, I don't know, 10, 15 drafts before we actually finished it, and we got some really nice feedback from the editor there, and that challenged Margaret. The feedback asked her to offer more descriptions of trees, and she actually went well beyond anything I could have written, and wrote really amazing descriptions of a forest in New Zealand and the west coast of New Zealand as the introductory paragraph. So I think Margaret in many ways expanded her writing skills in ways that I didn't, which is something I already said. But and then we were writing, and we're sort of almost done with an academic article. And that's been in some ways far more challenging because it's demanded from me, at least, but I think maybe Margaret can speak on this. It's demanded that I, even within my philosophical training, have to expand beyond my very limited philosophical training. So not only did I have to work with the background that I have, but as a philosopher, I had to start engaging with philosophical questions and concepts and traditions that I hadn't previously engaged with, because the kinds of project that this idea of environmental history and its relevance for ecological ethics was demanding, or was moving us towards, was an ethical project, and a legal, questions about ethics, questions about legality and so on. And I'm not trained as an ethicist. And so I just suddenly, over about a month's time, read as much as I could about ethics. and so this kind of collaboration even challenged me to become a better philosopher within my own discipline, to deepen my my knowledge of my own discipline and the kinds of questions within political philosophy, social philosophy, ethical philosophy. And that's been, I think, challenging, much more challenging than anything else in some ways, because I've had to do that all, you know, in a short amount of time, and in a way on my own, trusting that that I'm getting it.
So while we're on challenges, I hopefully you'll be willing to listen to me while I share a rather personal story, which is about who I am as a scientist, and how this collaboration really really challenged me to think about what science is, how science has developed over time in the Western approach to science, and really how useful the scientific method is. And so as a scientist, since I was 8, I bought into the whole scientific method approach. And I always knew that I wanted to be a scientist. And then suddenly to be my age now and a professor and thinking, oh no, I've wasted my life. I've thought that the scientific method worked, and I could be objective. I could take myself out of the equation. So naive. What am I done? And to reach that point because of interacting with ideas that I've not interacted with before, because I'd sort of committed myself to the whole Western science approach to thinking about the world. That was very challenging, can I just say. But I emerged, don't worry, I emerged to thinking, well, you know, there's still a lot of benefit to be had from taking a scientific method approach and looking for evidence and, you know, controlled experiments, blah, 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 all that stuff. But with a non-naive realization that I can't take myself out. I'm always going to be a human. I can't see the world as a plant because I'm not a plant, even though I might like to be able to do that. And so that was a big challenge, but also a turning point for me, I think, because now I'm sort of more realistic about what my own research can do. So thank you for your humouring me to tell that story. But it is important, I think, because we are, you know, Western science and that method has been so privileged in our world for so long. And scientists don't really ever question themselves and their place in the world and their approach to the world, their way of looking at the world. I know that people in humanities do, and that's awesome, but scientists don't often get that chance. So for that alone, never mind all the friendship and the trust that we've built, for that alone, I'm incredibly grateful to Dalia for allowing me to develop as a person. So back to you, Dalia.
I guess I'll just say a few more things and then it's probably time up, but I think that the thing that happened was so unexpected between us. The sort of, we didn't really have, like I said, any very clear agenda, and it's become very exciting as things proceed, and it's in some ways become the future project that both of us would like to pursue. So although we started with 0, we've arrived at a place where we can both imagine spending a lot more time working on the kinds of questions that we developed together. And so for both of us in some ways, this has become the most exciting part of our research. And also I have to say that the work I've done with Margaret has driven my other research, my interdisciplinary project. So it's always in the background. These kinds of questions that Margaret and I have been working on have been underpinning my previous book project that I was working on before I met Margaret. And so that's quite exciting. I think, as we said, there were some challenges, but I'll say one more challenge and then sort of say what I think is great about it again. We at one point thought about applying for an internal grant at the University of Sydney, and we realized that there isn't one. There are only within faculties, but there are no intra-faculties grants. And we actually told this to Duncan Iveson at the time, and he said, oh, that's a good point, and didn't pursue it further. So I think this was a challenge, that there was no way that we could actually formally work together through an internal grant that could get us up to maybe potentially applying for a larger non-university grant. And I think that's something that needs to be eventually addressed at the university if there is a serious interest in interdisciplinary research. But I'll just say, as closing, I'm inspired by thinkers like Alexander von Humboldt or Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, who were actively working across disciplines and who were doing both empirical research and study and observation, as well as engaging with philosophy and philosophical questions. And I feel like Margaret and I have arrived at a place where we can do the kinds of things that they did. She with her empirical knowledge and me with my kind of philosophical questions and approach. And I don't think I can do it as an individual. And I don't know if Margaret potentially can, I think, but I certainly can't. And I feel like we are together doing the kind of thing that that they were able to do. And so that is pretty much what makes me very excited about our project.
So no, I can't do this without Dalia. I would have to go back and do a philosophy degree, which I would love to do, but it's maybe too late for me. So yeah, so I'll just reiterate what Dalia said, that this is the most exciting part of my research right now, and it seems to be just opening doors to new ideas and new ways to do what I really started out wanting to do, which was to find a way to connect people to plants so that they would no longer overlook them, but they would start to connect on a personal level and start to care, and therefore start to protect the plants around them, and therefore protect their environment, because plants and environment are uniquely interlinked. And I think that's it from me.
Beautiful, thank you. I think you can see from the comments how awesome people felt that was. There are a few questions, but I'm actually going to pass over to Astrida just to make a few comments, and then we'll go to the questions.
Thanks so much. I will keep my comments to about 5 minutes. I know there are so many questions, and I really want to thank both sets of speakers for really offering us a lot of inspiring material to think with. So I'm a theorist, and I think one of the things I do is I think through concepts, and I use concepts to help me make sense of messy situations. So what I thought I would do now is offer a couple of concepts that I've been thinking with that I think are quite useful to think about interdisciplinarity. And I was hearing resonances of them in both of your presentations. And I think this might help to open up the conversation a bit. And both of them are actually about power. And really what struck me probably most in these presentations was, Margaret, your beautiful vulnerability when you began speaking, talking about feeling out of place and a little bit uncomfortable. And I think that really underscores how there is inevitably within any kind of interdisciplinary collaboration, or any collaboration, power, you know? And it's naive to think that we can do away with it, or that we can like put it away. It's really more about a question of how we figure out ways of managing it and sharing it, and perhaps like hot potatoing it, you know, back and forth, so we can both hold it a little bit, or we can all hold it a little bit, you know, within a collaboration. And that reminded me of the article that many of you will know, written by Deborah Bird-Rose about shimmer. And in that short chapter, she refers to Isabel Stenger's concept of reciprocal capture. And I'd never really thought about this concept in terms of interdisciplinarity before, but when I reread Deborah Bird-Rose's comments about it today, I thought, isn't this maybe what we're looking to do? And so in that Shimmer article, Deb says, quoting Stengers, reciprocal capture is an event, the production of new immanent modes of existence in which neither entity transcends the other or forces the other to bow down. It is a process of encounter and transformation, not absorption, in which different ways of being and doing find interesting things to do together. And for me, that is kind of like the sweet spot, right? That I think a lot of interdisciplinary collaborations inevitably have to struggle with. How do you find the place where you can both be reciprocally captured by other ways of seeing and thinking the world, without sort of annihilating or assimilating the other way in service of your own, you know? So I thought that was one thing we might want to think with in having our conversation as it continues. The other comment I just want to offer is actually about dissent. And it struck me particularly when, John, you were you noted right at the end that, you know, oh, there haven't really been any problems. We haven't had to deal with any sort of big tensions. And I think that's really interesting because a lot of us often go into collaborative work worried about that very thing. Like all of you mentioned how it's about finding the right people, people who you can, you know, trust and work well with, that you have some sort of energy that works well together. And we often look at dissent as a negative thing or something to avoid. And I'm not saying this is what you said, John. I'm just sort of extrapolating out from it a little bit. And there's a really great little short chapter by Manuel Tironi it's on a handbook of interdisciplinary methods. I can send through the reference if anyone wants it. But he gives a really interesting take on dissent, where he says, dissenting is not a dispute over opinions or perspectives, but a clash over modes of sensing, engaging, and inhabiting the world. But here's the clincher. He also writes that dissent is also methodologically empowering for the creation of an otherwise, right? Political capacities that can be unleashed when these mismatches are not worked through, but rather are used to enhance a new way of politically inhabiting the world. So the way we can use dissent to actually not just, and this links to the first point about the sweet spot, right? It's about not sort of settling on one side or other just to keep the peace, but to use those tensions to push something entirely new out of the collaboration. And I think both of you, you know, in describing the Urban Naturalist Project and in the Embodied Life of Trees project, kind of hinted at that. You know, there's something that you were doing together that you couldn't have done alone, and that probably, you know, working through that dissent is one important way to do that. So I'm just going to leave my comments there and hope that could maybe spark some more thoughts or conversations. I don't know if any of you want to comment on that before you open up the floor, but I'll leave that up to the chair to decide how to take things next.
If it's all right with the speakers, I might open up to the floor because we've got a little under 40 minutes and such a smorgasbord of rich thinkers here. But I might just take the chair's prerogative and leap from Astrida's beautiful notion from Deb Bird-Rose and Isabel Stengers of reciprocal capture to a question that Sue Reed and Maria both asked similar questions about those whom we're researching. When did they also become part of the research project or process? When do they become collaborators? So Maria and Sue, do you want to say something about that?
I'm just so fascinated by the subjects that aren't in the room. You know, and I you know, given all of the difficulties and you know, the fraught nature of potentially anthropomorphizing subjects and so on, I'm still really interested in just getting over that and finding ways that we might be able to actually, you know, acknowledge these others that we think with as exactly that. You know, that they're actually really dynamically present as conceptual agents with us. And how do we do that? And how do we do it respectfully? You know, in terms of building up a professional practice amongst us all of citing our subjects, which is a very, you know, long-standing feminist tradition, but also citing sort of more than human others, that is, but also of kind of troubling it epistemically. So how do we actually sit long enough with a tree to recognize that there might be something in how it connects with those around it and it, you know, within its own sort of life processes? What can we take from that? As, you know, what are there any sort of nodes within those connections that we can use for collaborative learning ourselves?
Thanks, Maria. I don't know, Maria Ayala. Oh, Maria, hi.
Yes,
do you want to
it's me.
That? You were asking about the birds.
Yes, thank you very much. It's been a very interesting exchange. My question was related to the birds because they talk first. And and it was that how do you measure in some way in your study the bird's perspective, and I mean they are in the city because of habitat destruction, survival needs, because they were more Facebook likers, but actually my research is about trees, native trees and pathogens, and I asked about the birds because I'm trying to include the trees as in format of my project. I've been walking around the forest and paying attention and see how the trees actually respond, not just to the pathogens agency, but also to the biosecurity measures that humans are trying to implement here. I'm talking from New Zealand. Sorry, I didn't did that at the beginning. I'm even trying to grow my own kauri trees, looking for these close connections with the species and this intimate knowledge. But with kauris, it takes a long time. So yes, I'm just wondering if you have considered that in some point, how to include it, that perspective of the other than humans involved. Thank you.
I'm also just going to again take the chair's prerogative that the speakers can answer that, but anyone else can also feel free to answer that if they feel that they have something to say.
So this is something I'm really grappling with, and it's so difficult with plants. With animals, I feel like we can have an empathetic connection to them because they move, they've got eyes, we can imagine that we understand their desires and their motivations. But with plants, they are so alien to us. They have chloroplasts, you know, sure, we share mitochondria with them, but they have chloroplasts. They make their own food. They're completely different. And we can only hope that we can understand what plants want out of life, if you like. And so this is really hard, right? Really challenging. So Dalia and I actually started thinking about how we could tell the tree's story. And this is how we started. This is one of the reasons why the embodied history of trees idea is very you know, appealing to me, because I could tell the tree's story. They could be present in the study without too much translation on my part. It was the true record of the trees in their chemistry and their tree rings. And I've had some other ideas about how I could, using scientific techniques and measurements, how I could sort of interview a tree, if you like, how I could pose a question to a tree and see how it replies. And so that is, that's very tricky for a plant physiologist to think like that. Can I just be honest? Because, you know, plants and animals are in different kingdoms. And like I say, they're alien. But I think there are ways using scientific techniques that we can start to look into the life of a tree and really think about what, you know, ways to interpret what they're doing.
So I mentioned Humboldt as one of the people that inspires me, and I think he's relevant in this on this topic because on the one hand he's very into measurement in the same way that Margaret is, and I'm not. But he uses those measurements to develop what he called a Naturgemälde, which is sort of translated like a picture of nature. And he was trying to really use measurements as a tool by which to understand and get at the essence of the phenomenon before him. So it wasn't like he was being reductive with these measurements. He was trying to get at something through the measurements. And this is, I think, if we study this notion of Naturgemälde, it's sort of, it's very phenomenological in a way that also incorporates science, that doesn't kick science and measurement out. And so it's, I think, a way of constructing a picture of what is before us, an image that incorporates the knowledge that we achieve through scientific measurement.
Yeah, I'll just add that as an ecologist, similar to Margaret, you know, it isn't my starting point. It certainly isn't the thought that I'm questioning. And so it's actually a really interesting question that I don't have a good answer to, but I'm going to think about it. So thank you for that, Sue and Maria. You know, just very peripherally, you know, thinking about the bird's story and some of the things that we do using ecological methods is looking at their social hierarchy and looking at how individuals interact with their mate, with their flock, and assess those, whether it's, you know, allopreening, whether it's feeding, whether it's, you know, these range of different behaviors. Predominantly aggression is a pretty common one in the animal world. You know, that's how the hierarchy ultimately gets established, is someone's on top of another. And seeing how those things change through time is quite an interesting thing as well, which, you know, we can actually follow birds and see that they were the top dog, so to speak, but that 5 years later, perhaps they were no longer holding that senior role. But thinking about how does the bird perceive these interactions and particularly those changes through time would be quite interesting. But yeah, so we don't have those answers. That's even when we look at some of the more complex systems. So soft-crested cockatoos are considered quite intelligent and have quite diverse social organisation. And that's a new thing. It's something that we're actually studying in a parallel project. And the model that we use for that is apes. So it's the sort of work that Jane Goodall did, looking at chimpanzees and their society. But as for how telling the story from the cockatoo's perspective, I look forward to thinking about it. I don't know. Thom?
I'm happy to pass on that one. I think there's a lot we could say, and there's a big literature in multi-species studies on what those methods look like. And I guess I would just say that I think these kinds of collaborations open up new kinds of opportunities there. And I think Margaret and John have sort of pointed, and Dalia have pointed to some of those. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, so I might just move to a different type of question. John had a really interesting, John Searle, if you want to ask a question about the way in which the research question model itself might constrain us. Do you want to speak about that?
Oh, I guess I had just a practical question around, I noticed that both presentations noted that they explicitly didn't use research questions. And I was interested in, you know, kind of thinking about what's the future for a model of research questions, if it always is kind of binds us to a disciplinary framing. Is there something which is, you know, the future of interdisciplinary research? Is it something without research questions? Sorry, it's a rambling question, but
that's great.
I think it's a super interesting question. I mean, I don't have an answer, but I do want to maybe recount a little experience I had a few days ago when I was Zooming into another seminar at Goldsmiths in London, you know, the way we can do these things these days. And I sort of had a similar confession to the one Thom gave when I said, you know, I'm not a very good researcher, you know, I'm not very good at sort of doing things the proper way, you know, that my discipline sort of suggests I should do. And one of the people in the room, it was Irit Rogoff, if anyone knows her work, said back, you know, well, I think her point was that we're entering a new kind of research paradigm, or that we should be, where research isn't about sort of collecting and giving back sort of existing knowledge, adding to it a little bit, but really emerging out of the situations we're in that are, you know, complex and like, I don't want to use the word unprecedented, but in some ways not yet, you know, fully imagined by us. So it's like the challenge of research is to not necessarily not have a research question, but to come up with an emergent research question that is coming not necessarily from a more traditional scientific process, but from this sort of in media res, where we are now with these different kinds of perspectives, right? Which then means the research process is also different.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I just want to say, I think it raises a really interesting question about what is necessary research right now, you know, and how do we go about doing that?
Beautiful, thank you. Julia, excuse me if I'm mispronouncing your name, had a question about the relationship between or the implications of the work on tree embodiment for human embodiment. Do you want to speak to that?
Hello.
Hi.
Yeah, it's Julia. Same pronunciation, just written in this different way. Yeah, I guess my question came from some of the work that I've been doing within the field work for my PhD, which I use a lot of embodiment, and actually it allows me to refer to one of the last phrases that Margaret said, which she said that it was tricky to it was tricky to define what the trees wanted to say and what their history was. I guess to put it into words, if I understood correctly, maybe in a more philosophical way. So it made me think that in general, my perception is that even within eco-criticism, we don't do the same, we have the same tricky problem with humans. We don't really look at the stories that humans tell from the point of view of their embodiment. So usually the kind of analysis that we're interested in eco-criticism relate to symbolic kind of representations and artifacts and so on. So because my fieldwork has been focused in trying to analyze stories that come from within actions, I've had some difficulties, and I found this tricky as well. So I guess I wanted to understand if they thought about any, if they came up with any consideration also about the role that embodiment has for humans, because they said the trees as organisms were a great, great, I guess, embodied beings. I believe we are the same, also just on a different scale. So that's what my question referred to. I don't know if I make myself clear. I guess it's very confusing in my head, and because it really brings so many thoughts. But and of course I understand that there's different time scales and different space scales when we're talking about humans and trees. But that's it.
Margaret, Dalia, do you want to respond?
I'll just say something that, so the current paper we're working on tries to talk about how humans can learn from this embodied character of trees. So what our claim is that we are embodied just in the same way that trees actually are, and that we're not reflecting on that embodiment, however, to the same extent, because we are not tied to any specific environment, and the environment isn't literally inscribed on every part of our body as it is with trees. Nonetheless, we can only exist within a very particular kind of environment. The earth offers that particular kind of environment. So we have a deep connection to this environment that, and so we try to understand what we can learn about living ecologically, so to speak, in light of tree environment relationship. So that's the extent to which we've taken it, is what lessons can we learn from trees about the nature of embodiment rather than the other way. So look, starting with trees and saying that's the kind of relationship they have to their environment. it seems to be the case that we can apply that to human beings as well. Although we are far more separate from our environments than trees, we similarly embody our environment, not to the same degree, but we do it nonetheless. And what kinds of lessons can we learn about our relationship to the environment in light of that sort of embodiment? We have not, however, really gone into questions of what is the nature of human embodiment. So we've really focused on trees rather than humans and trying to learn from trees. So I think we'd be interested to hear about the kinds of things that you've come up with in relation to human embodiment and how that might actually help us move forward in our thinking.
Yeah, well, I'm just at the beginning of my project, so I don't know if I have much to contribute to this, but I guess my fieldwork was in two permacultural sites, one in Italy, where I come from, and one in Australia, where I live. And the reason why I concentrated so much on embodiment was because I was interested in bringing permaculture into a humanistic perspective. So doing some ethnographic work, in my case, also ethnographic work, but then using my kind of background in languages and literature to analyze my fieldwork. So in a way, I was interested to see if I could tell the story of my fieldwork through my everyday actions. And so I think for me, it's been a very valuable process because it has helped actually touch with my hands some of the topics that I talk about and that I will talk about in my thesis, which revolve around 4 words, which are very basic for a human being survival, which are water, plant, food, and waste, and are fundamental in a permacultural site. And I think the reason why embodiment is important is that by engaging with each step of, let's say, the system that embeds these 4 words, I could actually, sense physically what I will be writing about. This is my particular insight: the fact that embodiment brings a physical and tangible dimension to a research that usually in the humanities, we tend to leave a little bit aside. In a way, it's like what Margaret said, that science, scientists think sometimes that they can, come out of the equation. Also, I find that sometimes in the humanities, we tend to spend so much time in abstract thinking that we lose the kind of, we lose touch with the topics that are very material. So my thesis will have a strong material-critical approach. And yeah, I guess the embodiment is fundamental to, if you want to describe stories from actions, then you have to live them. This is my personal experience.
Julia, are you the folks who have made the short film about permaculture in Italy? Is that you?
The donkey film?
The donkey film.
Oh, it was made by the donkey.
Yeah, I know.
No. But I think
which
it's
one?
The one
the
for
donkey film.
Yeah, the one for the conference, for the
I don't know, Thom sent it to me, but the reason I raised it is because, and yes, I might actually throw over to Julie, I think part of what I find interesting about what you're pointing to is I think it's also not just writing in general, but academic writing pushes us away from our bodies in the way that other media won't. So I hope I'm not putting you on the spot, Julie Vulcan, but I'd love to hear from you about, if you will, you don't have to, or any of the other people who work in different media here, about the way that they use other media to try and engage some of the complexities that maybe writing, particularly academic writing, is a bit resistant or hostile to. If I put you on the spot, just say no.
Just give me a moment, but there's so many things that have been resonating and kind of like roofing with here as well. And just as a quick introduction, my background is actually as an interdisciplinary artist, so I'm not an artist that has one mode of work. And I'm now in academic studies in interdisciplinary areas, so I'm not very good at being, in one tied down to one particular thing. So my mode is very often about moving and slipping around and finding the best kind of ways to express ideas. So I was even thinking about this idea of research questions. Often I kind of think that even when creating kind of art projects or art forms, it's like the critical thing is the idea, or the thing that's like giving you momentum or kind of making you kind of really vibe, and that is the thing. And then the research is actually like what is the best form to express that idea or that thing. So there's kind of a correlation between like trying to find your research question as well. Like I'm not very good at starting with a research question. I'm good at starting with something that's really, I really want to know that I can't find anywhere else, or that I really want to explore. And I think that the research, you have to kind of like, it's like Dalia and Margaret having those coffees for 3 years and kind of trying to find, the place where it all kind of coalesces and vibes and comes together. And I think that that's also in the art making process is a bit like that. You really trust a little bit in the universe, I say, like that things will kind of land. Sometimes you kind of feel it, you're pulling in all of these things, but suddenly it all kind of starts to sort of find a form. I don't know whether that actually answers your question, Danny, but I was just like, I was just thinking about all these the other thing I was thinking about, which is kind of along this way. So in my interdisciplinary works as art, in the arts particularly, I also have worked in devised theatre, which of course I would, because I don't like to do things that I've done before. So devised theatre is, you don't work with a script that's been written by a playwright somewhere else. You start from scratch, and you're in collaboration or in process with a whole bunch of people to make a work that's starting from scratch. So you have to find an idea, or maybe the research question or whatever that is, to drive that. But it's never like you start with the thing, because for me, I find that kind of, it kind of already limits your thinking and the ideas or the way or the avenues or the threads that you can explore. If you kind of try and contain something too quickly, then it's almost like you kind of cut off a whole bunch of things that could come in that you might not ever have found otherwise. So I think that's the beauty of devised theatre, when you don't actually kind of know what you're going to make at the beginning. It's kind of it's always this process, and I think that's the exciting thing about research, getting back to like what Astrida was even saying, like I think we are in a place where it's exciting to actually be kind of exploring new modes of research and research practice, and bringing in these kind of things. Are moving too fast in this world to just be reiterating things that have been done before. I don't know. Sorry, that's a bit of a rave. Sorry, Danny.
Thank you. Well, thankfully, I don't actually have questions, which means that unless I've missed someone, please tell me that I have. I'd love, we've got a little under 10 minutes. It would be great. A lot of themes have been raised. Oh, Shush, you're back. Sorry, Shush is gone. Oh, sorry. I tried to message you and said that you'd gone. So
I had shockingly bad internet this afternoon,
okay.
so sorry about that.
Sorry, I thought you'd gone. Go.
I hope I don't sort of like ask a question that has already been answered, but my question sort of touches on Adam's previous question as well as Sue's question around sort of non-humans as conceptual agents and this kind of practice of citation. And I'm sort of, my question comes in with, you know, a context where the humanities has been sort of attacked for a lack of pragmatics, a lack of utility, a lack of use. And my question is about what sort of a research project promises to do. And I wanted to shift it away from maybe this kind of idea of the research question towards the research promise. And, you know, in sort of the scientific discipline, there is this sort of like clear-cut idea of research benefit, research utility, the various sort of, you know, and this kind of like links into that language of progress and language of like inherent benefit. But I wondered whether in the humanities especially, and in our more than human sort of inquiries, we do have sort of accountability processes to ensure some sort of duty, some sort of obligation, some sort of promise, sort of like a deontic element to our research, of whether we do owe sort of more than human beings some sort of consequence to our investigations, to our interrogations. Yeah, so this kind of question of whether we have obligations to, and we have kind of obligations that are pragmatic in nature to the multi-species beings that we study, that we interact with, and is that sort of a doing good or is it a doing otherwise? So yeah, that's sort of like my question is around the pragmatics of more than human research and the protocols that we might set up with more than human beings. And yeah, that was my question.
Is there any, Margaret, do you want to take that up?
Strangely enough, I have a response to this, which surprises me. So since I moved to New Zealand late last year, I've started to have conversations with people about te ao Māori approaches to the world. And this was really an eye-opener for me. And it made me think about exactly what you're asking about. And I do think there is a lot we can learn from traditional knowledge and traditional ways of looking at the world, Indigenous knowledge. Because, so if I can give you an example that resonated with me, and that is that in te ao Māori, the certain tree species, in particular the large forest trees, are thought of as being older siblings to humans. But there's a very clear genealogy, and it's whakapapa, that runs through living beings, with trees as being the first offspring and humans as being, you know, younger. And to me, this changes the way we approach the world. If trees are our older siblings, then we have to be accountable to them. We have to think about their place in the world, not just as a resource for us humans, but as something with inherent place in the world of its own value. And so I think we can learn a lot from stepping away from the Western way of splitting nature and culture and bringing them back together again. So anyway, that's something I think it's only just new to me, and that's why I'm surprised that I have something to say on it. So I'll stop there.
I'm going to do the same thing. So Christine Winter has written quite a lot on this. I'm just wondering, would you like to say something to just add to what Margaret says?
Yes, I could. And kia ora.
Spotty dog speaking. Very glad to see.
Yes, I am my son's street art. So kia ora, Margaret. Yeah, Yes, everything in nature is our older sibling. And yes, it does change. Oh, sorry, I'll put my... And so yes, it does significantly change the way that we relate to the world and the way that we relate to our kin, and the way we understand how it is to be in the world. So if we take the idea that Margaret introduced us to a few seconds ago of whakapapa, that's the foundation of Mātauranga Māori, of Māori philosophy. And everything is about relationships. What is important is the way that we relate. So when we ask ourselves, what is it to be in the world? Or when we ask ourselves, how must I behave? You know, what our ethical foundations are, everything comes back to relationship. How do I relate? What is it to be a responsible relator or relative, as it were? So I don't want to take your thunder, Margaret. I'm absolutely over the moon that you have discovered these things. But yeah, it certainly means that you go through the world in a relational way, rather than as looking at everything as object, everything as subject.
Given that we're just at a couple of minutes to 6, I think that's such a beautiful place for us to end with and going back to what Dalia said about, rather than the von Humboldt or the Goethe doing everything within one body, we seem to be at this place where we're recognizing that it's in relationship, where we can both have reciprocity and difference and liveliness. And so it's not just interdisciplinary as a practice, but almost as an epistemology and a way of being, which seems to be where we're at. I want to really thank everybody. I'm sorry that not everybody got to speak today. Hopefully we'll all be here again tomorrow morning. Well, tomorrow morning, Sydney time. I'm not sure where everybody is. I want to really thank the presenters for your generosity and your transparency. It's really just beautiful to hear about the ways in which the relationships grow. And again, thank Gemma and Evie, Astrida, Sonia and Sophie. And I really look forward to seeing everybody tomorrow morning. Thank you.